Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and you guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And I had a video linked to me by Alan Thrall, whose channel I generally like. I don't necessarily agree with everything Alan does. I disagree with some things he does. It's a channel that I'm generally favorable to. I'd say 90% of stuff that Alan says, he gets dead on accurate as far as I'm concerned. Again, my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. And, maybe he gets 5-10% things wrong or that I disagree with, but largely he is one of the better channels out there regarding training information. But he put out a video about squat depth of him revisiting it, and someone sent it to me and said, hey, will you kind of look at this and give your thoughts on it? So let me put on my +5 hat of speechcraft, lovingly called my +5 hat of autism by many of you, and let's talk about it. Okay, so squat depth. I think one of the things that we need to note, because he did say that, look, if you're a competitive powerlifter, obviously you need to train to the standard you're going to be judged. Now, does that mean you need to always train to the standard you're going to be judged? No. No, not always. But you need to get very, very used to reaching competition depth. Now, why is this important from a judging perspective? A lot of guys are going to say, well, I don't care about my max squat. I'm not going to compete in powerlifting or whatever. Well, are you ever going to compare yourself to someone else? Okay, kind of come over to the point because a lot of guys will say, well, I don't care about strength. Well, if you don't care at all about strength, why are you training? You only care about your biceps. Well, you don't got to train your biceps for that. You can just inject stuff in your biceps to make them grow. People do it all the time. Most, if not all, serious professional bodybuilders have several inches of fake muscle in their biceps. Everybody who cares about just their size, they pin all sorts of shit in their body. All right, you can go sit on a machine and pump some cables and use whatever drugs you need to use and shoot synthol and whatever it is that you need to shoot and get implants, right? Just go get some implants, right? If that's all you care about. But for the rest of us, we care about actually being reasonably strong. And oftentimes those strength standards mean that we need to look at strength and conditioning charts. We need to know how maybe we compare to different lifters, different athletes, even if you're not going to ever step on a powerlifting platform. And I happen to like powerlifting. I enjoy powerlifting. Competed in powerlifting. I will compete in powerlifting again. I have judged powerlifting meets, which was a point of contention the other day. People said, no, you didn't. And I put up, a picture of me sitting there in a suit at an international meet holding buzzer, judging bench press. So, yeah, I actually happen to like this sport. I do participate in this sport. I even judged meets that I didn't even compete in. Actually, more than one of them. So, I enjoy it. But it's not everyone's cup of tea. But you do need to have a strength standard. We need to be able to compare ourselves to different people in terms of knowing where we're at compared to other athletes. We need to have a good assessment of our strength levels. Even if you're doing it for some other sport or just general strength, this is useful information. And if you do not have a metric by which to standardize a lift, you can just make up whatever you want. Did you move the weight? Okay, then. Because if you don't have a standard, you can essentially just come in and quarter squat. There are plenty of guys who do that. There are guys who think they squat 405 and you see them doing quarter squats with knee wraps. And in reality, they're a 200-pound squatter, right? That's the truth. They think they got 405 on the bar. That's what they think they lift. But they can't. So it doesn't give them a realistic assessment. And so the point is, why parallel? Well, the crease in the hip below the top of the kneecap, as Alan said numerous times in there. It's a standard. It's a standardized position that has been found in most people to generally be a favorable range of motion for size, strength, all that stuff, and safety. And the reason we discuss safety is that depending upon your personal biomechanics and mobility and everything else, going too much higher than that can hurt you, and going too much lower for some people, it's kind of, we have to note, for some people can hurt you. A lot of people, it's perfectly safe to go much deeper. So that is a very individual thing, isn't it? And that's a lot of what he brought up there. But if you don't have a standard in place, you can just do whatever range of motion you want, claim a lift is good, right? You can just go do 2-inch rack pulls for 1,000 pounds and claim that you're pulling 1,000 pounds when you're a 500-pound deadlifter. I mean, we have range of motion standards in place so that we can standardize a lift. Just like if you don't touch your chest on the bench press, you don't get to count it. I don't care if it's 405. Touch chest, right? We have range of motion standards for actual comparisons that have a real strength standard on a lift. And so you get a lot of this. People say when we talk about size equaling strength, well, yeah, there's a range of motion component to that too. We do generally mean size equals strength also relative to, how far you're moving the bar and your joint angles. But back over to the point, we do need those standards in place. But he brought up the point of for training effect, do we always need to hit that exact depth? No, of course not. Of course not. And I'll agree with that. In fact, what you find is that most of the studies that have looked at overall muscle growth, muscle development, which might be why a lot of you are doing it, might be why a lot of you are squatting, or for just general performance and general muscle activation being around pretty close to parallel or slightly below in that range. And you got to remember there's a slight range there. There's a variant. Is generally going to produce the best muscle activation. Generally, not always. Most of the time it's going to. It's a nice safe zone. And it's also your lowest safe zone for injuries. Meaning if you squat too high, you basically do a half squat, it puts more shear on your knee. Okay, it is going to put more shear on your knee. You are at a higher risk of injury. You're going to be one of those people who talks about how squats hurt your knees. All right, the half squatter always ends up being that guy, right? That gives squats a bad name. And there's a lot of reasons we could get into why it does it. I've covered it in the past. It's a multifold reason why it does that, but it has to do with shear stress on the knee and the amount of weight you're using, because you have to squat heavier than your max with a half squat to get any effect. Otherwise, you get no training effect. And so again, that shear stress put on your knee with more than your true 1 rep max, it causes problems over time. Squatting too deep, if you're one of the people who loses tightness, you get, too much posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom, it can injure you, right? It can injure you, or at least have a higher rate of injury. Sorry guys, I gotta have motorcycles driving by, again, part and parcel of living in a big city. So, yeah, you can get hurt depending upon the person, but there are people who also have so much mobility and they're so flexible that they can drop ass to grass. And I'm talking 5 inches below parallel. Right? I mean, and he used the example of Clarence Kennedy. Clarence Kennedy is a perfect example. He's a genetic freak. The guy is stupid strong with stupid levels of mobility, and he can do things that you and I are not going to get away with. He is one of those guys that can put 600 pounds on the bar and drop it 5 inches below parallel and squat it right up like it's nothing. Again, that's freakish. But, that's what happens when you're a freak, genetic freak like that. He can do it. But he also is able to maintain his tightness, right? And if you can maintain your tightness and you want to go quite a bit below parallel and you can do so safely while, again, maintaining tightness, having everything aligned properly, it's not a bad thing. I mean, if you want to train that way, in that case, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it might be favorable for some people. But you got to come back over to specificity of what you're doing. You've got to have consistency in what you're doing. And it's kind of the point we come to of what sort of depths do you need to hit to get a proper stretch reflex for the style of squatting you're getting. And I think that's a valid tool for training too. And he brought that up about the stretch reflex. Where your point of stretch reflex is on your depth is going to vary based upon foot position. How much you open your hips up, how your feet are placed is actually going to determine kind of where your point of stretch reflex is. And again, as he talked about for, say, a power lifter, that helps you move through your sticking point. And your sticking point on the squat isn't the bottom. It's not the bottom. And he is right. I've missed a squat in meet before. I got it started out of the hole. Right? I got that squat 6 inches out of the hole, 8 inches out of the hole. And then it stopped. And then I got stapled to the floor. I mean, we've seen me do this, right? We've all done this on a heavy enough lift. It's exactly what happens. It's not right at the hole. But that stretch reflex and training the stretch reflex can help you get enough speed to get through that sticking point. And it's what he talked about. He mentioned that. And so we kind of come to that point of you should definitely, as a general rule, unless you have a reason to change it, otherwise, and again, let's come over to these different topics between novice, advanced, intermediate lifters, which I've been talking about some. Unless you have a reason to do otherwise, it's probably a good idea to squat to the depth to where you can get a stretch reflex. Why? Well, not only does it help you push past sticking points, but a stretch reflex itself does what? It tends to have its own muscle fiber recruitment component. Well, that's a good thing, because generally speaking, irrespective of what our training goal end game is, most of us are generally training We are generally lifting weights or doing our resistance training. It doesn't even have to be a weight. It could be a dumbbell, it could be a cable, it could be a band. But generally, we are moving these weights for the purpose of recruiting muscle fibers, right? We're trying to activate and train muscle fibers, right? And I think we can all agree with that point. Well, the stretch reflex has its own additional muscle fiber recruitment component. It is generally a good thing unless you have a reason specifically to remove it. And it's not a bad thing to train. So that's the kind of the caveat I would add to that. You need to find your individual depth that works for you, but generally speaking, hitting about parallel, if you can't hit parallel, you need to work on it. That's a mobility problem. That is a mobility problem. You do need to work on it. But as long as you're probably somewhere within maybe an inch of parallel, or you're able to go below it and you're able to get a stretch reflex and stay tight, anywhere in there is probably reasonably acceptable depending upon your training goals. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.